We are at the University of Milano Bicocca. I'm Maria Luisa Lavitrano, professor at the Medical School and National Node Director for Italy of the Infrastructure for Biobanking, BBMRI ERIC. We are here with Professor Mats Hansson, Director of Center for Research Ethics and Bioethics at the Uppsala University and Director of BBMRI ERIC Common Service LC. In this webinar, we will explore how to manage ethical issues in research infrastructure organization. Professor Hansson, to give some context to our conversation, can you please take us through your career and tell us about your current position?
Oh yes, so my career has been like this. I started in biology. I took my first degree in biology and then I moved on to theology. I have been working in several positions in different organizations. I was rector and president of a school of theology for some years. And then I moved into a research area, ethics and bioethics, and took my PhD in that area. And then gradually worked together with colleagues, scientists at the Faculty of Medicine at Uppsala University. And there we started to build up a network of researchers that are skilled in ethical, legal, and social issues regarding clinical research or clinical practice, what is going on at the hospital, or what is going on in association with research projects. So we started 20 years ago, myself and another person, and now we are 30 senior and junior scholars from a multi-disciplinary background. So there are philosophers, medical doctors, nurses, lawyers, social scientists involved in that. And we have during the years been involved in many large research infrastructures and research projects across Europe and also across the globe. So that is my background. We are currently coordinating and leading several of those work packages on LC issues, ethical, legal, and social issues.
I'm glad that you are being here. You have a great experience. So can you please tell us what are the main ethical issues and concerns in running a research infrastructure?
Yes, I could say maybe one should then distinguish between two different kinds of ethical and legal issues. It depends, of course, very much on what is the subject, what is the field of interest for the research infrastructure, because different research infrastructures are involved with different subjects and they give rise to different ethical issues. So, for example, in many of the research infrastructures on biomedicine, life science, and for example in BBMRI, which is a network for facilitating collaboration across borders between biobanks in different parts of Europe, using their biological samples and the associated data, that could be medical data, personal data, different kinds. What they face are very difficult problems related to access to data, sharing of data across borders where you have different regulatory frameworks governing the research and the use of data. Different procedures for ethical review, different procedures for informed consent. So these ethical and legal issues need to be managed very concretely in relationship to the subject, to the field of research interest of the research infrastructure. But then there is another set of questions related to infrastructure in Europe and international, and that is more related to the processes, how you set up, how you build, the governance structures, how you make decisions transparent, how you get people included. One of the very characteristic features of any infrastructure, that there is 1, 2, 3 persons, 3 individuals maybe, that come up with an idea, see a need, try to bring things together. And these are the driving individuals. But then, in order to be an infrastructure, you need to have engagement and inclusion of a lot of other people from other countries, from other research projects. And The difficult task for these initiators of the research infrastructure is to make sure that you create a sustainable research infrastructure, and that is related very much to the processes.
In fact, my next question is what are the implications, the ethical implications on the management of a research infrastructure, and how to create an ethical awareness and a good ethical environment in a research infrastructure environment?
I think that the driving motive and sort of the driving inspiration for setting up an infrastructure is always related to a task, something that you want to do, something that you want to achieve. You want to, like Bibem or Eric, you want to have a collaboration to facilitate research, to bring new knowledge to patients and new treatments and so on. So these are the driving forces. However, a research infrastructure, in order to reach that objective, you really to think through the management of this infrastructure. How shall this work? How can you get access to the right people? How can you get them involved and included? So I think one pays, in my experience, in the beginning of this, one pays too little attention to these managerial issues. And I would suggest that what we have been doing in some cases is to set out on some specific basic values that should be guiding what we are doing. So I could give you some examples, if you want.
Yes, please.
So one example is transparency. That it must be possible for all participating in the infrastructure to know what is going on, what are the objectives, what do they expect from me, what can I expect from others, so how are decisions being taken, who has an influence in the decisions. So transparency with regard to decisions, how resources, how funding is distributed across the infrastructure. So transparency, but also a basic value like democracy, that everyone should have a possibility to have his or her place in the infrastructure, to have a voice, to have a freedom of opinion, to have a say. If you do not from the very beginning allow differences in opinions, in ideas about how to build this infrastructure up, you will later have problems. But if you can foresee that and have a joint discussion about what are we going to do, how are we going to do that, and of course that is, you still need leadership. You need someone that can lead that discussion with the focus on the task of the goals, the objectives of the infrastructure. So there's a risk that you set up trying to be inclusive, trying to get everyone on board, but you get fragmentation and you have diverse opinions and views, and some are strong and some are weaker. So you need to have a leadership closing down, closing in, focusing, keeping everyone on track.
Can you suggest operating tools to reach this objective? I
can suggest the primary operating tool, and that is not a device, that is not a computer, that is not something technological. I would say that the most important operating tool is related to attitude. That is the attitude of the general director, of the person running, the manager, the leader, or the leadership. So I have been in research infrastructures where the leadership is so filled with their own view of what is going to happen and how it's going to be, so that they tend to have a sense of too much control. But you need to have a process where you include others, and so that attitude of openness, of listening, is, I think, I have wonderful examples of leaders of research infrastructures that are, sometimes there are really heavy discussions, fights going on, and then you have someone that is very calm and listening and taking on, yeah, okay, so maybe we should do like this, and in order to incorporate these important concerns, but now we have to move.
Don't you think that we might need a code of conduct?
Oh yes, you need a code of conduct. We have set up some of these research infrastructure. One is called RD Connect. That is a large European project on rare diseases. The idea is connect researchers from different countries that do particular parts of research on genomic studies, omic studies, that is finding biomarkers, targets for drug development, and biobanks. So they ship loads of data and try to combine data. It's really necessary to collaborate across borders, because in rare disease you have few patients in each country, and that they are not sufficient to do research upon. So you need to collaborate. So in that case, you need to have openness, transparent, you have legal premises that you have to fulfill, you have to take into account the regulatory frameworks in the participating countries, the regulatory frameworks for collaboration across countries, and in the countries where, for example, a database or a repository is placed. So what we set up is a code of conduct for doing that, so that there are clear definitions. What terms do we use? In this case, it was about shipping data and transferring of data. So then you need to have a clear definition and a common understanding of what is a personal identity. What does it mean to pseudonymize, to give a code to data? What does it mean to withdraw data? What does informed consent mean? If you say we should have broad consent for future purposes, how broad is that? What does that imply? So common understanding of the essential terms, and they should then have a backing in the legal framework. And then the process setting up of certain rules so that everyone knows what can be done and what cannot be done with that.
So can you underline steps to be considered in developing ethical guidelines for running a research infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that one should have, the first step is to have a common understanding of the goal of the infrastructure. What is the task, the aim of this infrastructure? The second part is related to now, how are we going to address those ethical and legal issues pertaining to carrying out this task? So identification of these ethical issues. I've been in several projects where we have scientists that are really skilled at everything related to the science, and then they were thinking about the ethical and legal issues. Yeah, well, we don't see any ethical issues here. And then you need to bring in people that are experts in that field on ethical, legal, and social issues to help you identify pertinent issues. Because if you don't do that in advance or early on in the project, what may happen is that you later on discover that, oh my God, this was a very sensitive ethical issue that might be very sensitive in society. I can give you an example of that. And that is that we are currently involved in my center with a research project where you use human embryonic stem cells. And that is a controversial thing because we look upon those and the moral status of those stem cells differently across borders. So the idea here was to use these embryonic stem cells to derive progenitor cells that then could be used for insulin production. So they will be specifically targeted towards producing insulin and put in the body in a ceramic box responding to the blood sugar level. Very sophisticated technology. And when you do that, you need to address the ethical issues. These are donations by couples that go through in vitro fertilization. These are questions about the moral status that are sensitive. If the journalist comes later and asks you about some of these ethical issues, there's one answer that you can't say, and that is, oh, we didn't think about that. Everyone understands when you say, well, this is a complicated issue. We have been addressing this from the start. We are trying to handle this in that way. We are trying to find more expertise in knowing to do that. So this is difficult for us, but we are having a methodology for using that. But you can't say, oh, we didn't think about that. So that's why it's very important for every research infrastructure that early on, with the help of expertise that can locate. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an ethicist. So, but I have some knowledge about law in these areas because I've been around here some time. But then when I talk to a specialized lawyer in administrative law or in public law, of course they know about legal matters and they can say, well, wait a minute, here, as for in this human embryonic stem cell project, now there are intellectual property rights here that you have to consider. And the status from a legal point of view of this sort of biologic drug that you are developing is not really clear from a legal point of view. So that needs to be investigated. And I had no idea. So if you don't do that and get the right expert people on board early on to identify the ethical and legal and social issues, then you may lose out. Then you cannot carry out what the task is. So that is one of the most. The others, when that is done, you need to find a proper sort of way of bringing these people on to investigate these in a thorough manner. A problem with research infrastructures is in that regard that research infrastructures do not fund research. They integrate and collaborate and make use of research already done. But for some of these ethical and legal issues, there's really a need to investigate the implications of different legislations and different ethical frameworks. And in order to do that, you need to have it, that investigation must be based on sound research and scholarship. Because in ethics, there is the possibility of a lot of opinions, and everyone has a free say to have an opinion on how things should be done. But you need to have a reasoned conclusion and argument where you take into account the state of the art of the literature. So there needs to be some investigation, some kind of research and development within the ethical and legal part in order to run an infrastructure, and that must be remembered. So the infrastructure on a whole is for bringing issues on food and health or energy or biobanking or whatever, and that builds on the research already taking place. But for the ethical and legal issues, you need to have some kind of research and development in order to find out how to handle the ethical issues. So when that is done, you need to bring on the right people. Then you need to focus on the management. How are we going to build a sustainable research infrastructure that is not destroyed by too many conflicts among the people working with it?
I do agree with you completely that sustainability is an ethical issue in the management and in the governance of a research infrastructure. Yeah. Let's discuss about research integrity.
Yeah, that has been a growing concern. And you can wonder, why is that so? And I would say that, of course, there have been some, not increasing, but some new elements, occasions, situations with scientific misconduct, where some researchers jump, don't get the ethical review, or they plagiarize what others have been doing, or they don't keep attention to the primary data. They sometimes don't have the primary data that back up their claims. It has not been very many, but it's sufficient with one such example, and there are quite a few now real examples of scientific misconduct. And of course that is enough with one example, one case, in order to disrupt the trust. So every scientific work and every research infrastructure is working based on public trust from politicians, trust from governments who put the money in. They must trust that you are doing well. I was sitting in a parliamentary committee in Sweden on good research practice. And while we were doing that this was for all parliamentarians and experts, and I was the principal secretary of that. While we were sitting and discussing how good research practice, good research conduct should look like, there was a case with fraud in science at Akademiska Institute in Stockholm. And a senior scientist had in an oncology project published article, and it turned out to be false in the sense that he had invented patients that were not there. And the parliamentarians should have seen the reaction of the parliamentarians. They were really now, is that what you are doing? Is that what science is about? Can't we trust science? So it's one case. So it can really be devastating. I think that is one explanation of this growing concern on research integrity. And what we have been doing in Sweden after that is that now in many faculties of medicine, faculties of science and technology, faculties of social science, we have mandatory courses in research ethics and research training in order to get them to understand what are the rules and how do you deal with primary data.
Thus, the question to you is how a research infrastructure can promote and guarantee research integrity?
Well, I think they can do that in several ways. One is to have a clear policy, like in a code of conduct or something, how you're going to deal with fraudulent research in terms of investigation, in terms of access to, say, the common resources that you have. That is what we built in the RD Connect. But also, research integrity is related to conduct of research, that you do the right things. So, and serious misconduct or fraud in research may be rather uncommon, but you have equal interest in getting to terms with carelessness in science, with sloppy research. So we know, for example, that NIH has made an investigation and found that almost 70% of all research that is published in good journals is not reproducible. You can't reproduce the results, even if you try to use the same. And of course, this has some inherent scientific characteristics. This is very important and very difficult to get the right material, the right conditions to do research. So probably that is not. But part of it might be because we are not really so detailed concerned with the good methodologies that we need to do. So people are sometimes jumping, not storing data as they need, not having primary data backing up as it, changing protocols during the course. So this is also part of the research integrity, to follow the research procedure, and that has to be part of the research infrastructure. You must have a quality control of the processes that you put in order to collaborate in a research infrastructure. You must have a system for controlling that quality, so that you have to be able to monitor that everything is coming in the right way, according to the right procedure. So that is also part of a research infrastructure that doesn't have these quality assurances built into the system, is losing in research integrity, losing in trust, and will not be able to fulfill what they are getting at.
Thank you very much. I have quite a number of few questions for you. Collaborative knowledge, collaborative governance. Why sharing collaborative knowledge and cooperation are key infrastructure elements? Because
I think the simple answer is that you need the collaboration of everyone when you set up in order to reach your end, to fulfill your task. And then you need a collaborative governance. And that means that there's often some kind of sort of coordinating center or a management group, leadership group, and then there are different responsibilities, maybe in different countries, and you need to have a management structure where also the sub-task leaders and those people in the periphery are aligned with what is happening. If you don't get alignment from them, you will not succeed. So you need a combination of a top-down and a bottom-up approach. A top-down approach in the sense that everyone must be aware of that we have certain goals, we have an end, we have certain tasks to fulfill. This is what we're going to do. I can give you an example of that, and that is we are running and coordinating a large project called IMI Prefer. IMI is Innovative Medicines Initiative. It's about elicitation of patient preferences to be part of the regulatory process for approval of drugs, new drugs. The goal of that project is to provide recommendations to regulatory authorities. The way to that is to investigate with scientific accuracy different methodologies to use, test them against each other, try to find if they are generalizable to different disease areas and so on. But you have always to have your focus on the recommendation. This is what we are going to achieve. And you need to have everyone, and you need to have a governance structure where everyone sees, yeah, that is the goal.
I have a last question for you, and is about engagement, publicity and engagement. Can you discuss this issue?
Yes, I mean, all infrastructure, in order to manage an infrastructure, you need to have clear action points, clear timelines, so that everyone involved knows what to do, what to deliver, and when to do it. You need to have a system for monitoring that, so that you can tick off when things are done, so that you can take measures when things are not done in the right time. Because in an infrastructure, different aspects, different tasks integrate and interrelate to each other. So you can't be delayed in one because that will affect on another part. So you need this. But in addition, and that is quite often forgotten actually, you need a communication plan. You need to identify who are interested, who do we want to reach in association with this infrastructure. Do we need to reach the general public? Do we need to reach media? Do we need to reach policymakers, regulatory authorities, patient organizations, different international organizations? Who is your audience and how do you reach them? And I think that is extremely important.
Including the research community.
Yes, including the research community. So, for example, in this IMI Prefer project we are setting up, we have experts on the issues, but the issues that we are working on, the methodologies that we are using, they are part of a larger research community. So there is a research community working on this. There are experts around. And if you want to be successful in your research infrastructure, you need to be aligned with what is going on. It doesn't mean that you have to have consensus of everything, because that is not attainable in science. But you need to have and deserve trust from the scientific community on large working in this area that this is a good piece of work. So your peers might not agree with everything, but they must say, well, they did this thoroughly. This is good, this is sound research.
Can you tell us a case study?
Yes, I can tell you a case study. Regarding this issue, I think the current running IMI Prefer project that we're running is a good example, where the situation here is that this is about elicitation of preferences in health research. And this is a fairly young science, so it's not really mature. That means that there are different groups with quite diverging views. If you go to some of these conferences and international conferences, you can see that there are really hard fights on what to do. Should this be done, in this case, by economics, or psychologists, or public health persons, and they have different traditions, different views, and they haven't really reached a consensus. When you run a research project, a research infrastructure, in that context, you need to be aware of this, and you need to address, you need to present what you are doing. And these people might not agree every time with you, but they must see that you are working with it in a sound scientific way. But there are other, public engagement I think also is very important. In all research infrastructure it's important to identify stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in this? In this case it was the patient organizations, regulatory authorities, it was health and technology assessment bodies. We had a precursor on different project that was running before, and I will not give the name of that, but their problem was that they brought in the stakeholders far too late. So they brought in the stakeholders, in this case the patient organizations, who were really the concern. This was in order to elicit patient preferences in association with drug development. And they brought in them too early, so a lot of things have been settled, a lot of definitions have been made, a lot of tasks have been identified that were not really learned there. So that was a failure. So in the IMI preferred project, we said we have to include these at the very beginning. You need to have continuous discussion with them to include them. And also for the regulatory authorities, if you want to have something that is useful for them, for practical use, or for the industry to use in their decision making, it must be relevant, it must be practicable, operational for them, so that they can use it. So you have to bring them in the beginning, and not starting identifying stakeholders later. And then of course there is a need to, in many research infrastructures, to have a sort of public engagement, to have through citizen panels, or making sure that you make surveys in order to understand what are the questions, what are the issues, how do people see this. So there are different ways to do that, but you need to reach all those, and you need to have a communication plan, how to reach them, when to reach them.
So can I ask you please to make for us a summary of the key learning point, the key message to take home on these issues?
I would say that because I was also thinking about another example in the previous question, and that was a research infrastructure that really somewhat collapsed. And it collapsed because, I would say, for lack of transparency. What are the tasks? What are the expectations? Lack of transparency with regard to setting up a governance structure where everyone feel included. Lack of transparency with regard to how funding was distributed. And the lack of discussion on these basic values that we need to have in place in order to run the infrastructure.
And how did it arise?
Well, it arose because some of the original funders got in a serious conflict because they one person was accusing the two others for cheating, for not being fair, not being open, having made promises about funding that was not kept, and so these kind of things. And that started a series, and people start writing emails to each other, and that is not a good way of communication. So what we did is that we brought people together face to face in order to identify what are the problems here and how can we solve them, and what are the values that we need to have in place in order to do that. And that is where I suggested then that identify those basic values and do them operational in the governance of the infrastructure. I think that is the most important. And the other lesson I would say is that many of these research infrastructure in biomedicine, life science, physics or whatever, try to bring in people early on that can help you identify the ethical and legal issues before it's too late.
Thank you very much. This is a good conclusion for our conversation.
Okay, thank you very much for interesting questions.